for joining me today. I've been working on a little collection of some florals, and our goal here today is not to create a finished painting. And as you can see, each time I do this painting, it looks a little bit different. And as you follow these tutorials, just know that your paintings are not going to look like mine either. So the goal is not to copy my painting, but the goal is to learn about composition and color schemes and some techniques that will help you just get better and better at your watercolor painting. And I'm learning too. I started painting in 2018, so I'm learning right along with you. I'm just sharing some things that I've learned about the medium, and we're learning together. So today our goal is to learn how to prepare a composition, to select our colors, and to learn a little bit about how I created the flower heads themselves. So there's a special technique that I used for that I'd like to share with you today. So let's get started. I'm painting with a 6x8 watercolor paper block of some brand new paper that I just got. It's called Canson Heritage. It's 100% cotton rag, 140 pound, and I just love this paper, the way it handles paint. So I'm excited to share that with you. So I'm using the Canson Heritage paper, and I'm using the Daniel Smith palette of his palette of Cottage Gardens, and that includes in the palette a Quin Rose. It has Cascade Green and a Serpentine Green Serpentine Genuine. I also threw in for some darker reds because I didn't have that on the Daniel Smith palette. So this is also a really nice paint by Core, and this is Quin Magenta that I'll be using for some of the centers of the flowers and the darker values that I'm going to need in this painting. The brushes that I'm using today are mostly from the Princeton Heritage line. So I have a number 6 rounds. I have a number 5 and 0 round. It's also from Princeton Heritage, and the 5 means that the bristles are 5 millimeters long, and it's a size 0, so it's a very thin brush for small details. I have a number 2 Princeton Heritage liner that does a nice job. And this brush I want to introduce to you, it is a Royal Langnickel brush, and this is a very inexpensive brush, but the Royal Langnickel Zen, this is their Zen line, and this is a synthetic brush, but it has a nice shape to it, has a good snap, and it blends really well. I also like the handle on the brush is very comfortable and lightweight. And this brush just handles extremely well, and I use it a lot. And I think for this number 6 rounds, I think I paid less than $7 for it. So this is a real bargain if you look for those Zens by Royal and Langnickel. So those are the brushes we'll be using today. All right, so before we start painting, we need to kind of get our composition in an idea of where we're going to place the flowers in our composition. So I'm going to use a cross design. It's just a way of looking at how the paper is laid out and how my items are going to be laid out once I paint them. So I like to use the rule of 3 and thirds. Well, I should say the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is when you break your paper down into a little grid. So I'm going to divide this paper into 3 rows and 3 columns. And I'm just putting this these lines down. They don't have to be exact. I'm just putting very light lines. You might not even be able to see them on the camera. And I'm using Prima watercolor pencil so that as I start painting, these lines will disappear because it's a watercolor pencil. Okay, so now I have 9 rectangles on my paper, very loosely drawn. And the idea is that your focal points should lie on one of these 4 intersections. So it can either be here, 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 or here. So I'm going to choose to use the diagonal that's going to run from this corner to this corner. So that's my first line. So my flowers are going to lie across this line, and they don't have to be right on the line. This is a guide, so I'm going to adjust as I paint. And the next part of our cross, my greenery, I want to spray up this way. I'll have some greenery mixed in with my flowers too, but I also want to have greenery kind of spray. So I'm going to skew my line a little bit. I'm not going to start right at the corner. I'm going to move over a little bit. And I'm not going to go right to this corner. I'm going to come down a little bit, just to skew the line just a little bit. So this is generally how my greenery is going to go. So you can see that's a really rough little sketch just to help me with the placement of things that I'm going to paint. I'm going to start my first flower right here, and I'm just going to lightly spritz it just a couple times just to get some water droplets on the paper that will help my paint to move a little bit. Get that out of the way. And let's start with our Quin Rose out of the palette here. And I'm using my number 6 round, the Zen brush, because it's a rather stiff brush, but it's got a good point and it holds a pretty good amount of pigment. So I'm going to go to the center of my flower, and I'm just going to drop in some very dark pigment, just kind of a messy little center. Okay. And I'm going to take a clean brush, rinse the brush out completely, and just with a little bit of moisture on the tip of my brush to help things move a little bit. And the idea here is to take your brush, create the place where you want the color to run, and then just push into the pigment. Alright, just in a little place. I'm going to turn my paper, clean my brush. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go all the way around. Make sure you have enough water either on the paper or the brush. You may have some dry places on the paper, and we want that because we want some of the color to blend away, but we want some edges to stay on our flower too. This is a very loose floral. Okay, don't want quite so much. I'm trying to avoid any hard lines at this point. We're going to keep everything nice and loose and flowing. Okay, we're going to push into the color and just wiggle it a little bit so the color will disperse. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to leave some white space as I go. I just didn't want that much white space right there. So just keep going around, cleaning your brush in between each time. Okay, now I'm going to come out even further. I'm going to do the same thing. Wiggle, push into that pigment just a little bit. Let's find another place. Wiggle, push into the pigment just a little bit. And we keep going around until you get your flower head to the size and color that you want. Okay, now the centers of the flowers always need to be darker. And remember I said I put some of that Quin Magenta from Core on my palette. So I'm going to dip into that. And this also has a little more red in it. So it's a little more on the violet shade than a pink shade. And I'm going to just drop a tiny bit of that right into the center of my flower. And see how that immediately, because of the quality of the paper and the paint, is starting to spread out into my flower head here. And I'm not going to mess with that. Let it do its thing. And let's move on to another flower head. So now we're going to be talking about the rule of 3. We had the rule of thirds on our paper. And now we're going to talk about the rule of 3 when we have several similar objects on our paper. We don't want 2 of something or 4 of something. We want 3s and 5s. We always want odd numbers of things on our paper. So we call that the rule of 3. All right, so that is spreading beautifully. I'm going to let it go, except for I see a little puddle forming here. So I'm going to take my brush, which is now pretty dry, and pick up some of that moisture so that it doesn't create an ugly bloom on the edge of my paper. We want nice, beautiful edges. And if I wanted to, I'm not going to do it on this one, but if I wanted to, I could actually blend the edge of that flower all the way out until you couldn't see the edge at all. And that one's looking fine the way it is, so I'm going to leave that there. Okay, let's go on to the next one. I'll show you a little bit of a different method. I'm going to put some water on my brush, and let's come here. I'm going to generally follow that line. So let's see. Let's put another flower right here, and I'm going to tap, just this time, water droplets rather than using my spray bottle. I'm going to put droplets down. So now I have some dry areas and some little water droplets. So let's get some paint on our brush and see how this one will look a little bit different. And I'm going to go to where I want the center. And you see now I've got some. This is going to be a much more defined center than that one was, because it's dry. Most of the paper is dry and only a few little water droplets caught the edge of that paint. So let's go in. I've got probably my brush is half loaded with water. I would say that. Blot off if you have too much water. And I'm going to go in. I'm going to use the same. Create the place where you want the pigment to flow, and then push into the pigment. Turn your paper as you go so that you're always pushing in and not pulling out. You want to push the tip of your brush in to the pigment. You'll get a whole different look if you go in and try to pull it down. You will pull much more pigment that way. If you push into it, you have a much more controlled, you can control how much pigment you pull by how far you push your brush into that pigment. All right, so we've got a very delicate petals coming out now. We'll go into this area. Everything's still pretty damp. Okay, we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to go in this time. I'm just going to go back into my Quin Rose here and drop that in the center. I went into my Opera Pink, but I meant to go into the Quin Rose, so I'll go back in the Quin Rose and I'll drop just a little bit right in the center. And while I have it on my brush, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to darken that center just a little bit as well. Okay, go back in here. This is all about the amount of pigment that you're dropping down. So drop a little, and if you need more, you can always add. It's easier to add than it is to lift out. although you can lift out if you need to. All right, now I'm going to go to this little detail brush. This is my teensy tiny round, and we're just going to get it wet with no pigment on it. And what I want to do here is, I think I'll start with this one while it's still wet. I want to pull out a few veins in the flower petals. So I'm going to go to where my pigment is the heaviest. I only have water on my brush, and I'm just going to very lightly start pulling out a few veins into my leaves here. And you can see that because of the way that we're creating these flower heads, some little petals are starting to emerge where we had more water on top than what was on the bottom. So it created, this is a controlled bloom. You see it has no ugly edges on it, but the water did push pigment out. So we have a little petal that is sitting right on top there, and that is looking, that's what that is what you want to see happen in watercolor. Okay, so over here, let's go to the second one. I just want to pull out a few veins in the leaves here. And these will become a little more pronounced too as your painting dries. So let's see, where would another one look nice? Here's our line. Just a tip, make your largest petal in the center and put smaller ones around it so that your eye is drawn to the center of the picture and not being led out to the edges. So let's see where we can place another flower head. And let's come a little bit off the line here, and let's come over here and put one more in on that one. And I'm going to just use this spray bottle. Try to cover up what you've already done so the water doesn't hit it and you'll lose all those beautiful bleeds that have already occurred there. So I'm going to just protect. In fact, I'll turn my paper around and do it better that way. I'm going to protect what I've already painted. Just put a couple spritzes, not too much water, because it will, you don't want it to turn into a blob of pink. You want some definition to stay in the center of those flowers. So I'm going to go back into my Quin Rose. Let's see, we're going to put the center of our flower head, because you don't want like a straight line of anything. You want things staggered. You want to alternate size, and you want to alternate the line that things sit on, just to add interest to your painting. So this, we're working on the center of the flower, and my paper is just damp from what I just sprayed. Rinse out your brush, no pigment in the brush. You're going to pull the pigment from, make sure you have enough water, not too much. Create the place where you want the pigment to run. Turn your paper so that you're pushing in and not having to reach at an awkward angle. The other thing that helps me is I hold my brush really toward the end, because that's going to give me a looser stroke rather than choking up like this on the brush. Let your brush be very loose. Okay, create the space and pull the pigment. Let things flow. I love to see that pigment run. Plain water, reach in, grab a little of that pigment, and let it flow. All right. Let's come over here. Okay, there you go. The edges are getting a little hard in the middle of this particular flower, so I'm going to just spritz it a little bit with my water. That will soften the edges. In kind of a random way. So that's looking rather nice. Okay. And when you're doing these florals, you may start with your paper oriented this way, but as things progress, I always like to turn my paper around and see which way this painting is shaping up. And I still think that I think this orientation is still the best right now. We'll see what happens as we go along. So now I want to go into this core Quin Magenta, and I just want to darken up my centers a little bit. I'm going to drop in just a little bit of pigment in the center. This is going to add depth to your flowers because the color is deeper. It has a little more red in it, so we're getting more of a purple or violet hue, magenta. And I think I'm going to leave that third one be. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and just let that finish doing its thing and spreading, and we'll be back after that dries and we'll start putting in some greens. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, we're back, and my painting has dried, and you can see that I've added some additional flowers to the painting where I thought it would enhance the painting. So now we're ready to work on our greens. To add a little backdrop to the greenery, this Quin Gold I have found makes a really good just a backdrop to lay some beautiful greenery on top of it. So I'm going to still follow our cross composition. So you see that I have four kind of, I guess you can look at it as corners to our painting, but I only want to put the Quin Gold enhancements to 3. I don't want to set up too much of a concrete pattern. We want to try to stay away from those patterns so that we don't take away from the interest of the composition. So I'm going to come up here and I'm just going to give some indication of some plant foliage. I'm going to use a very diluted pigment here and just some random marks. We will be painting on top of this, so you can think of it as a sort of a backdrop to the greenery that will go on top of it in a little bit. Okay, so there's one corner. And while I'm here, I can actually do a little bit of negative painting around this one flower head. Because we really want to showcase the flowers in the painting. So the greenery is not what we want to draw our eye to. We want to draw our eye to the flower head, so we want to keep the rest of the colors and values at a lower value than the flower heads. So you can see that that makes that flower head pop right there. And I'm going to do the same thing down in this corner. So I'm going to start with a line, just a line like a stem, so I can see where I'm going. And then to those stems I'm going to add some random, just plant like matter, but it's very abstract and nothing needs to look perfect. In fact, the more random it is, sometimes the better this works. Okay, so we've got some plant matter going on down here. And again, this flower head right here, I'm going to take this opportunity to do some negative painting around the flower head to try to make that one pop. So there we go. Okay, and we can add to that as we go along. Okay, now I'm going to come to this corner and do the same thing. So which flower do we want to make pop? Well, I see that this one has the most definition, and it's really has some beautiful markings to it. So I'm going to focus on that one. And so let's get our line in. And I'm going to do some negative painting around that flower head. And then just come on out here with some markings that look like foliage. I'm going to do some negative painting around the edge of this plant, edge of this flower head here. See how it made that corner, made that petal right there pop. And later on I can add some more definition to the veins on that petal. That will make it pop even more. Okay, so throw a few leaf-like shapes in here. Nothing has to look exact. And try to vary the intensity. And we're just framing these flower heads. Okay, so we're going to stop there with the Quin Gold. And now we want to go into we have Serpentine Genuine, and we have Cascade Green on our palette. And I've mixed quite a bit of yellow into these greens. So we want, in watercolor, work from light to dark. So I'm going to start with this light, very light kind of spring green. And thinking about our composition shape of the cross, I can see that my next line comes across this way. So I'm looking at this area right here. So let's see if we can find a flower head that we can do some negative painting on this way. So I'm going to, first of all, I'm going to throw in a line, just a stem. Okay, we can add to it later. And when we're doing these, the thickest part, the leaves, will be closest to the flower heads, and then as we move out, the details on this plant, on this stem, will get finer and smaller. So here's a nice flower head, so let's do some negative painting around that one. So we throw some leaves right next to it to make that stem, or make that petal pop out. There we go. And let's add some more. I'm gonna, by the way, I am working with a Princeton Select Dagger Striper right here. And this is a nice brush because I can get some fat lines with it, like I made these leaves with it, but then I turned it on its end, and I can get some nice thin lines with it as well. But right now I need a brush to create some leaf shapes. So I'm going to pull my round number 6 back out, and I'm going to now come right in here, and I want to just drop in some leaf shapes. Okay, you see I'm kind of stippling and stamping in these shapes. I'm going to come back here next to the flower head and just drop in a darker green because I want to showcase that flower petal. And then I want to come out here. The closer we get to the end, things get smaller and just a little more delicate. So let's come here, throw a little leaf in there, and let's do some negative painting around this one. Rule of 3, we don't want to leave 2, we want to have 3 or 5, whatever it is that we're painting. Okay, so I'm going to leave that right now, and I'm going to come down here. I'm going to balance a little bit with some green negative painting again around these petals. Switch up the color just to add interest. Switch up the color and shape. Okay, random marks. But you're thinking color, you're thinking just the beauty of watercolor here. So you're trying to make things look beautiful. Let's put in an actual leaf shape here. So in order to do that, I'm going to turn my paper around and work on this stem. Like a small stem, point of the brush, and lift it back to the point. And now this looks like a leaf. Drop in a little color at the stem, and we're going to come over here and make another one. Little stem, point, push, and lift. We got a couple little leaves going here. Let's make another one because we want to make sure we have 3. We don't need to put in every stem. Because this is a representation we're not trying to make it look like a photograph. Okay, and remember, we're putting in our larger shapes now, and then we'll go back in later for some finer detail. So we're not putting everything in now. We're at a fairly light value of green, and we'll come back with a darker value of green in a little bit. Okay, so now I'm looking, and I think we are going to, let that dry and come back for our final details with the darker green. So I'll see you in a few minutes. Welcome back. You can see that I've been working on this painting, adding darker greens closer to the flower heads, some stems and just fronds of leaves and greenery around my flowers. I used a very diluted green wash here, and I blended it out just with a wet brush and loads of water and blended the green out. I added a little bit of pink here you can add as much or as little greenery as you like in your painting. And don't be surprised, your painting may look very, very different than mine. I'm just sharing methods and techniques that I use in my floral paintings, but everyone will turn out differently. So have fun with it, experiment, practice with your brushes to see what kind of marks they can make before painting or on a separate piece of watercolor paper. Have fun with it, and I thank you for joining me in painting this floral, this little bouquet of pink flowers, and I hope that you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.